Hello, this is Dr. Eric Bricker, and thank you for watching A Healthcare Z. Today's topic is physician performance reviews explained. So, between undergrad and medical school, I actually worked as a hospital finance consultant. I had a job, and at that job, and I was on a salary, and like many other people with jobs who were on salary, I had performance reviews, and whether I was promoted, and if I got any sort of bonus at the end of the year, or if I got a pay increase at the end of the year, it was based upon my performance reviews. So I'm like, okay, now that I'm a doctor, where are my performance reviews? And I had performance reviews when I was in my clerkships, my third year of medical school. I found that the feedback was obviously super helpful, okay? In my residency, I had 0 performance reviews. And in my, I worked as a hospitalist physician with a large hospital system. Also, 0 performance reviews while I worked as a hospitalist. So I'm like, okay, what's the experience in general for physician performance reviews? And this is particularly relevant because, right, as we move from fee-for-service to value-based care, it's like, okay, well, are we going to translate the value-based care into the performance review and then have that impact physician's salary? I mean, what's the status of that? And then also, as we have physicians moving from independent to being actually employed, whether it be by a hospital system or a private equity firm or an insurance company, like United employs a bunch of doctors, or retail, so for like Amazon or Walmart. So now that physicians are like employees, then the matter of the performance review is also becoming increasingly important. So let's look at physician performance reviews. Okay, so I went out and I sort of surveyed, I took an informal survey of some of my colleagues in a variety of clinical settings in various parts of America. And so for the physicians that worked at, sort of large academic medical centers, they said, look, there is a formalized annual review process. It does involve your productivity, in other words, your RVUs that you build out, but then it also involves things like, feedback from actually medical students that they're training, plus feedback from patients. It does involve a clinical issues like, how well you can controlling blood pressure or controlling hemoglobin A1C if you're a primary care doctor, or chart reviews for various other medical specialties. At another medical center, they even had metrics around things like hand washing and meeting attendance. But at the end of the day, the overall compensation impact for not the RVUs, but for all the other measures, it was pretty minimal. It was only about 2 to 4%. It was like they gave all the doctors basically a 2 to 4% raise every year. And if you were not a good performer, you got a 2% raise. And then if you were an excellent performer, you got a 4% raise. And if you were in the middle, you got like a 3% raise. Okay, now at a community hospital system, so not academic, but also for an employed physician at a community hospital, there they have reviews annually around things like your length of stay. They do have patient surveys. Interestingly, one of their metrics was the ER callback time. In other words, when the doctor was called by the ER, how quickly did they return the phone call? And the sort of benchmark that they used was within 30 minutes. So interestingly, they had a hard time getting the doctors to call the ER back, so they tied their performance review in part to calling back the ER in a timely fashion. Okay, they also did chart reviews so they could kind of clinically review what the person was doing with their patient care, and they also took nursing feedback as well. But again, the financial impact of all that was only about 3% of their overall take-home pay was based upon the performance review. Okay, next, in private practice, interestingly, they tend to divide up the doctors in sort of 2 groups, sort of the younger non-partners and then the older doctors who are partners in the practice. So for the non-partners, the younger docs, they do have RVU sort of productivity benchmarks and requirements that they need to meet. Plus they would sit down like every 6 months with a more senior partner to talk about like how things are going, maybe review some charts, etc. Now, interestingly, for the partners, nothing. And this is from multiple private practices. There was no performance review process for a variety of specialties in a variety of parts in America that if you're a partner at an independent practice, at a private practice, there's potentially no performance review process at all. And this is important because when you go to a hospital, especially like a community hospital, not all the doctors there are going to be employed physicians. You're going to have a mix of employed physicians and physicians like specialists that are going to be in private practice, but they still have admitting privileges at the hospital, and they're going to see you. So you're going to have a variety of physicians with a variety of performance reviews seeing you, not only in the hospital, but also in the outpatient clinics associated with that hospital system. Okay, now, so I'm like, okay, well, for a hospital system, they have like certain rules that they need to adhere by in order to receive Medicare payment, and those being accredited by the Joint Commission. The Joint Commission is actually an independent organization. It's not part of the government. But in order for a hospital to get government payment, it has to be approved by the Joint Commission. So I'm like, okay, does the Joint Commission have rules around what kind of performance review process a hospital should have? And the answer is yes, they do. They says, look, the hospital has to have an eval process every 12 months, and it has to have both qualitative and quantitative aspects to that review. And the sort of the leverage that they use, because obviously for the private practice physicians, then like the hospital doesn't employ them. So like they can't like give them a raise or not give them a raise because they don't employ them. But really the leverage that the Joint Commission says to do is that this needs to be done through the admitting privileges process. So in order for a physician to have admitting privileges at a hospital, then that physician's practice or group or they themselves must have a performance review process. Now it sounds like, no process is perfect. It sounds like there's private practice physicians that have admitting privileges at hospitals that actually don't comply. So, it probably should be no shocker that the letter of the law and the rules are not like perfectly followed, so just be aware of that. Okay, now, the whole idea of performance reviews is not new, okay? I've got a little bit of a sort of an ecclesiastical view of the world, which is to say that there is nothing new, okay? So this entire process of doing performance reviews on people is not new, even for people who are very educated, are very highly compensated, and work in life and death situations. Like just because you're smart and you get paid a lot and you work in life and death situations, that doesn't absolve you from the performance review process. And believe it or not, there was this gentleman by the name of Napoleon Hill who was actually commissioned by Andrew Carnegie to study success. Not only Andrew Carnegie's success at Carnegie Steel, but success across many different industries. And what Napoleon Hill found was that all these large organizations had a performance review, the successful ones had a performance review process that involved what he called the QQS system. And QQS stands for the quantity of work, the quality of work, and the spirit that the work is performed in. Now, when I've made these videos before about value-based care and fee-for-service, and I'm like, well, the physicians should be on salary, then I get all these comments that are like, yeah, but that salary is based on RVUs. Listen, of course, part of a performance review is going to be based on the quantity of work. And one way to measure the quantity of work is the RVU. So would Napoleon Hill in his study of performance reviews say that using physician RVUs should be a part of the performance review process? Of course, right? You can't have some doctor just twiddling his thumbs all the time, not doing anything. I remember when I was a medical student, there was this radiologist that we could never find. And we were waiting days to get a read on an MRI. And our job as a medical student was to chase this guy down and to convince him to sit down and actually read the MRI. Okay, so that's a rather extreme example. But the point is that you actually have to do the work, right? So you gotta measure that, okay? Next, the quality of the work is also important, right? And so this is where, look, there are steps in all of these organizations around the quality of the work. Now, one might argue that I would tell you that my informal survey said, look, a lot of this stuff is just kind of for show and hand waving, and it doesn't have any real consequence to it. In other words, it doesn't really change the physician behavior, and you can tell by the amount of money that they put behind it that it really doesn't, it's not given any financial teeth. And so from a best practices standpoint, I'll leave a link in the show notes, but for more senior managers and executives at an organization, upwards to 20 to 30% of their total annual take-home pay should be based on their performance review. So having it be 2 to 4% is 1/10 the dollar amount that it should be in terms of the percent of their overall take-home pay. So arguably, there's some increase in how much of a physician's take-home pay should actually be based on their performance review to give it some more teeth and actually modify the behavior to in the direction that would be best for patients. Okay, fine. So then there's the quality, and then finally the spirit of the service. What Napoleon Hill meant by this. And oh, by the way, this was chapter 7 in his book Think and Grow Rich. But Chapter 7 says that the spirit is really like the spirit of teamwork. Like how good of a teammate are them as they produce the quantity of the work and the quality of the work. And again, this is a huge deal for physicians, right? Because everybody has a story of a physician just acting like a complete jerk. I mean, there are situations where like the nurses are like scared to call the physician because the physician like constantly yells at them every time they call them. I mean, in my opinion, like being a good team member is a patient safety issue. Obviously, providing high quality care is a patient safety issue. Obviously, providing a certain quantity of care and not just twiddling your thumbs all day, not reading MRIs, that's a patient safety issue. Okay, so arguably, the issue of physician performance reviews is a patient safety issue that, you know, just like everything else in healthcare, has a lot of room for improvement. But that's the way I would look at this, not in terms of like judging or not judging physicians, but in terms of like, look, if you are a patient going into a hospital, like you should just know, like, I was shocked. Like, I'm like, well, where's my performance review? Like, when I had a job, like I actually found the performance review process like actually helpful because my boss actually took the time and explained it to me and we set out goals and I could, you know, so it's like, it's not perfect, but if you were a patient, you'd be like, oh, by the way, like your doctor, they're not reviewed. Like that would kind of make you think twice as a patient. Okay, so finally, are there other organizations that deal with life and death situations where they have a very intentional use of the performance review process? The answer is absolutely. And one of those examples is the United States military. So I was reading this book about, it's the biography of John Boyd, who was actually a colonel in the Air Force, but he's actually, everybody within the Marine Corps knows who John Boyd is. He actually has a statue of himself in the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, so a very famous military leader. And in his biography, it talks about a very detailed performance review process that he would go through. And I was shocked at what he in the Air Force had to go through in terms of a performance review. So I looked up, and it turns out that all the branches of the military have very detailed performance review processes, and they have like manuals that explain their performance review processes. And this one is specifically from the Army, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes. But they said, look, you know, the people within the Army are going to be reviewed based upon their results. Okay. Well, that makes sense. You know, are you accomplishing your mission, whether it's a mission in training or an active duty mission? Okay, fine. So that results is kind of around the quantity and the quality of the work, right? Because obviously if you're going to get results, you have to have a lot of results and they have to be good. So obviously that's important. But notice the other areas that are part of the formal review process in the Army. You're reviewed for empathy. You're reviewed for physical fitness. You're reviewed for tact. You're reviewed for expertise. You're reviewed for fostering an esprit de corps, team spirit. You're reviewed for, do you build trust? You're reviewed for innovation. Are you constantly trying to improve the policies and procedures and tactics that you're using? Interestingly, so much of the review process for the military involves the spirit. It's not just quantity. It's also, listen, they're dealing with national security, life and death situation, like stuff that blows up and breaks down and crashes and can be sunk. I mean, they're dealing with very serious situations. And so they know that you need to have serious performance reviews when you're dealing with serious situations. And even in the private sector, like if you read Jack Welch's autobiography straight from the gut, listen, GE was like the #1 company in America in the 90s when Jack Welch was running it. And regardless of your opinion of him, that book goes into incredible detail about the performance review process at GE. And it was incredibly rigorous and incredibly stringent. And Jack Welch spent a ton of his time doing performance reviews. My dad was an executive at a defense contractor where frankly, like what they did, again, kind of because they worked with the military, like it was of like vital importance to like national defense. And like all my dad did was like performance reviews all day long. I'm like, Dad, what'd you do today? Oh, I had a performance review. And so like Most of his career was during the Cold War. And so it is just vitally important for the performance of an organization, including a healthcare organization that is taking care of patients, to have a sophisticated, detailed, financially impactful performance review process. And we just have a lot of room for improvement for that in healthcare. And that's my point for today. Thank you for watching A Healthcare Z.